Sarah Collins was 28 years old, and she had already lived several lifetimes of struggle. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 every morning, dragging her from the 2 hours of sleep she managed to steal between her daughter's coughing fits and the anxiety that kept her staring at the ceiling. She would kiss Emma's forehead in the darkness, careful not to wake her, and slip out into the cold pre-dawn streets of the city. Her car had died 3 weeks ago, the transmission finally giving up like everything else in her life. So now, she walked 3 miles through neighborhoods that grew rougher with each block, her breath forming clouds in the November air, her second-hand coat doing little against the wind that cut through to her bones. Murphy's Diner sat on the corner of 5th and Morrison like a tired old man who refused to sit down. The neon sign had lost its P years ago, so it just read Murhighs in flickering red letters. Inside, the booths were covered in cracked vinyl patched with duct tape, and the air carried the permanent smell of burnt coffee, bacon grease, and something else. Something harder to name, desperation maybe. The dreams people carried in their pockets and left behind in the tips they couldn't quite afford. Sarah tied her apron at 5:45, exactly 15 minutes before her shift officially started, because she needed every dollar, every cent, and Harold, the manager, noticed things like punctuality even if he never acknowledged kindness. The diner floor was a stage, and Sarah performed her role with a smile that felt like lifting weights. "Good morning. What can I get you?" "Coffee's fresh. I'll be right back with that." Her feet ached in shoes held together with superglue, but her voice stayed warm. At home, a different reality waited. The eviction notice was taped to her apartment door. Red letters screaming final warning, 48 hours to pay $3,200 or be removed. Emma's medical bills sat in a drawer. Sarah couldn't bear to open anymore, the numbers climbing into territories that made her hands shake. Cystic fibrosis. The doctors said the words with sympathy that did nothing to reduce the cost of keeping her daughter breathing. The medications alone cost more than Sarah made in a month, even working doubles, even taking every extra shift Harold offered. But here, in the diner, she smiled. She remembered regulars' orders. She asked about their days. She gave homeless people free coffee when Harold wasn't watching, paying for it herself from tips she desperately needed. Because kindness cost nothing, her mother used to say, back before cancer took her too. Sarah carried that weight in silence, the way women learn to carry everything, invisible and endless and crushing. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. He appeared on a Tuesday morning when November had turned bitter and mean. Sarah was refilling coffee for the construction workers at table 4 when the bell above the door chimed, letting in a gust of wind that carried dead leaves and the smell of coming snow. The man who entered moved slowly, carefully, as though his bones might shatter if he rushed. He wore a coat that had once been brown but had faded to something closer to gray, the fabric threadbare at the elbows and collar, missing 2 buttons. His shoes were scuffed leather, worn down at the heels. The kind of shoes that had walked too many miles and seen too many winters. His hands trembled as he reached for the door to close it behind him. Whether from cold or age or something else, Sarah couldn't tell. He stood in the entrance for a moment, scanning the diner with eyes that seemed to be searching for something specific. Or perhaps just searching. Those eyes caught Sarah's attention immediately. They were pale blue, watery with age, but beneath the physical fragility was something that made her chest tighten. A loneliness so deep it seemed to have its own weight, its own gravity. She had seen that look before. In the mirror on her worst nights. In her daughter's face, when the other kids' fathers picked them up from school. The old man chose a booth in the corner, the one with the best view of the street but the worst lighting, and lowered himself into the seat with the careful movements of someone whose body no longer obeyed commands easily. Rachel, the other morning waitress, glanced at him and made a face. "You take that one," she muttered to Sarah. "He looks like he can't afford to tip." Jennifer, working the counter, didn't even look up. "Probably smells too," she added. Loud enough that Sarah wondered if the old man heard. But Sarah was already walking toward him, coffee pot in hand, that smile on her face that wasn't quite performance anymore. Not for people like this," she said, her voice carrying genuine warmth that surprised even her. "Cold one out there, isn't it?" The old man looked up at her, and something flickered in those lonely eyes. "Surprise, maybe. Or hope. Black coffee," he said, his voice rough and quiet. "And one piece of toast, dry." His hands shook as he tried to fold them on the table. Sarah noticed everything. The frayed cuffs of his shirt. The way his collar didn't quite fit anymore, as though he'd shrunk inside his clothes. The dignity he wore like armor despite everything suggesting he had nothing left. "Coming right up," she said softly. "And I'll make sure it's nice and warm for you." The next morning, he returned at 6:47. The morning after that, 6:47. Again. By the end of the first week, Sarah understood that this wasn't coincidence. He arrived at precisely 6:47 every single day, rain or shine, as though his internal clock was set to that exact moment. He always chose the same booth in the corner. He always ordered the same thing: black coffee, one piece of toast, dry, and he always counted out exact change from a small leather coin purse that was as worn as everything else about him. Sarah began to prepare for him. At 6:45, she would wipe down his table even if it was already clean, making sure the salt and pepper shakers were filled, that the seat was free of crumbs. When he walked through the door, she would already have the coffee brewing fresh, the toast in the toaster. "Good morning," she would say, and he would nod, something that might have been a smile touching the corners of his mouth. The small gestures came naturally, an extra piece of toast that she slipped onto his plate, telling him the kitchen had made too much. A second refill of coffee before he could raise his cup, before he could even think to ask. A pat of butter wrapped in foil that she left beside his plate, even though he never asked for it, just in case today was the day he wanted it. She never made a show of it, never drew attention to what she was giving. She just gave. He rarely spoke those first few weeks, but when he did, Sarah listened. He mentioned the weather, a program he'd watched on television, the way the city had changed over the years. Sarah never pried, never pushed, just nodded and responded with her own thoughts, creating a gentle rhythm of conversation that asked for nothing and offered everything. "That strange old man is back again," Rachel said one morning, loud enough that several customers looked up. "Don't know why Harold lets him take up a booth for an hour just for toast and coffee." "He pays for what he orders," Sarah said quietly, refilling sugar dispensers at the counter. "Plus he probably can't afford anything else," Jennifer added, smirking. "Did you see those shoes? I've seen better at the Salvation Army." Sarah's hands stilled. She turned to face them, her voice calm but carrying steel underneath. "He's a paying customer who's never caused trouble. That's more than I can say for some people." The other waitresses exchanged glances but said nothing more. Sarah went back to work, and when 6:47 arrived the next morning, she had his table ready, his coffee hot, and a smile that told him he mattered. The eviction notice changed from yellow to red. Final warning. It screamed in letters that seemed to grow larger every time Sarah looked at them. 72 hours. Then the sheriff would come. Then she and Emma would be on the street with garbage bags full of their life, nowhere to go, no family left to call. Sarah stood in her apartment at 3 a.m, staring at that notice, doing math that never worked no matter how many times she calculated it. Her paycheck was $400 short. Her tips, even pooled together from 2 weeks of doubles, wouldn't cover it. The number sat in her stomach like a stone. Emma's medication had run out on Thursday. The pharmacy wanted $260 for the refill. Without insurance, without help, without miracles. That was the price of her daughter breathing clearly. Sarah had called 3 assistance programs. All had waiting lists. All said they'd get back to her. All meant she was on her own. She'd tried to stretch the last few doses, giving Emma half portions. But the coughing had gotten worse. The sound of her daughter struggling for air in the next room was a knife that never stopped cutting. The car had finally given up completely. The mechanic said the transmission was gone, said it would cost more to fix than the car was worth. said he was sorry, but there was nothing he could do. So now Sarah walked 3 miles through neighborhoods where streetlights stayed broken and police sirens sang lullabies. 3 miles in shoes that had holes she stuffed with cardboard. 3 miles while it was still dark, while the city still slept, while her feet screamed and her lungs burned, and her mind circled the same impossible math over and over. Harold called her into his office on Wednesday afternoon, his face carefully neutral. "Look, Sarah," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Business has been slow. I'm going to have to cut some hours. Starting next week, you're down to 35 hours, maybe 30. 30 hours. That was another $150 gone. That was the difference between maybe surviving and definitely drowning." She wanted to scream, wanted to cry, wanted to ask him how he could do this when he knew, when everyone knew, when the whole staff whispered about poor Sarah and her sick kid, but she just nodded. "I understand," she said, because what else could she say? By the time 6:47 arrived on Thursday morning, Sarah had been awake for 23 hours. Her hands shook from exhaustion and too much coffee and not enough food. Her eyes burned. Every muscle ached. But when the old man walked through the door, she smiled. His table was ready. His coffee was hot. And she treated him like he was the most important person in the world. The old man watched. He sat in his corner booth with his coffee growing cold. And he watched Sarah Collins move through the diner like light through darkness. He saw things the others didn't see. Or chose not to see. He saw the way she touched the shoulder of the widow who came in every Tuesday, the one whose husband had died last spring, the one who still ordered 2 coffees out of habit. He saw Sarah sit with her for 5 minutes during the breakfast rush, holding her hand, listening. He saw the homeless man shuffle in on Friday morning, dirty and desperate, smelling of the streets and defeat. Rachel moved to intercept him, her face twisted with disgust. "We don't serve your kind," she started to say. But Sarah was already there, stepping between them. "It's okay," Sarah said quietly. "He's with me." She led the man to a booth, brought him coffee and eggs and bacon, food she paid for with crumpled bills from her apron pocket, tips she couldn't afford to spend. The old man watched her count those bills carefully, watched her hesitate for just a moment before handing them to Harold at the register, watched her smile, never falter even as she gave away money she desperately needed. She didn't announce it, didn't make a show of her generosity, just did it, as though kindness was as natural as breathing. A young mother came in with a screaming baby, frazzled and near tears, fumbling with a diaper bag while trying to find her wallet. The other customers frowned at the noise. Jennifer rolled her eyes, but Sarah was there, helping organize the diaper bag, bouncing the baby while the mother ate, making faces that turned screams into giggles. She told the mother, "We've all been there." The old man noticed Sarah had never been there, had no ring on her finger suggesting a partner who'd helped with such moments. But she said it anyway, making this struggling mother feel less alone. Near closing time, an elderly couple grew confused about their bill. Certain they'd been overcharged, their voices rising with frustration and fear that someone was trying to cheat them. Harold was impatient, ready to call it a mistake and kick them out. Sarah stayed. She went through every item with them slowly, patiently, explaining each charge, showing them the menu prices. Taking 20 minutes she wasn't paid for to ease their worry. When they finally understood and apologized, embarrassed, Sarah squeezed their hands. "Please don't apologize. I'm just glad I could help." The old man in the corner watched all of this, and slowly, carefully, he began to understand exactly who Sarah Collins was. Tuesday morning arrived wrapped in fog, the kind that made the world feel smaller and quieter, as though the city itself was holding its breath. The diner was nearly empty. Just Sarah, the old man in his usual booth, and a truck driver at the counter who was more interested in his newspaper than conversation. Sarah refilled the old man's coffee for the 3rd time, and instead of nodding his thanks and returning to silence, he spoke. I lost my wife 3 years ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as though the words hurt coming out. She slid into the booth across from him, something she'd never done before, and waited. "Cancer!" he continued, staring into his cup like it held answers. 42 years of marriage. 42 years of knowing someone so well you finish their sentences. And then one day, they're just gone. The world keeps spinning, but you're stuck in that last moment forever. His hands trembled around the cup. "My children," he said, and something bitter entered his voice. "They came for the funeral. Asked about the will before we'd even buried her. Haven't heard from them since, except through lawyers." "Lawyers," he repeated, as though the word itself was a wound. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The old man looked up at her, those pale blue eyes wet with unshed tears. "And you?" he asked gently. "I see you, Sarah. I see someone who carries weight." She hadn't expected the question to break her, but it did. "My husband left when our daughter was diagnosed," she heard herself say. "Emma, she has cystic fibrosis. He said he couldn't handle it, couldn't handle a sick kid, couldn't handle the bills, so he just left 4 years ago. Haven't seen him since." Her voice cracked. "She's 7 now. She's so brave, braver than I'll ever be, and I can't give her what she needs." "You give her everything," the old man said with sudden intensity. "I've watched you. You give everyone everything." For a moment, they simply sat there, two lonely souls in a near-empty diner, connected by loss and loneliness and the strange comfort of being truly seen. But in the old man's eyes, beneath the grief and gratitude, something else flickered. Something purposeful. He was looking for something, Sarah realized, searching for proof of something, testing whether what he saw was real. And slowly, carefully, he was beginning to hope. The storm hit on a Thursday, brutal and unforgiving, the kind of cold that turned breath to ice and made bones ache. Snow fell in sheets, wind howled between buildings, and the city ground to a halt beneath winter's fury. Sarah arrived at work before dawn, her face numb, her fingers barely able to grip the door handle. At 6:47, she waited. The door stayed closed. At 7 o'clock, she started to worry. The old man had never missed a morning, not once in the 6 weeks since he'd first appeared. Rain, cold, whatever the weather brought. He was always there at 6:47 precisely. But today, the booth sat empty. Sarah went through her shift on autopilot, serving customers, pouring coffee, but her mind was elsewhere. What if he'd fallen? What if he was sick? What if he was alone in this terrible cold with no one to check on him? She dug through the receipts from last week until she found it, the one time he'd paid with a credit card instead of exact change. Harold Mitchell, and an address in the older part of town. Sarah bundled herself against the cold and walked. 40 minutes through the storm, her inadequate coat doing nothing against wind that felt like knives. The address led to a modest apartment building with peeling paint and cracked concrete steps. 3rd floor. No elevator. She climbed, knocked, and waited. "Who is it?" His voice sounded weak. "It's Sarah, from the diner." The door opened slowly. The old man stood there in layers of clothing, his breath visible in the air. The apartment was freezing. "The heater broke," he said, embarrassed. "Last night. I called the landlord, but he hasn't come." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I'll be right back." She ran to the corner store, used $15 from her tip money to buy canned soup and bread, then returned to heat the soup on his ancient stove. While he ate, she called 3 repair services until she found one willing to come out in the storm. "That'll be $150, the dispatcher said. Sarah closed her eyes. That was money she didn't have, money that should go to Emma's medication. Money that meant another thing unpaid. "Send them," she said. The eviction notice came on Monday. Not a warning this time. A final decree. 48 hours to vacate the premises or the sheriff would remove her and her belongings by force. Sarah stared at the paper taped to her door, the words swimming before her eyes. 48 hours. 2 days. Where would they go? Emma's coughing woke Sarah at 2 in the morning, harsh and wet and desperate. She ran to her daughter's room, held her upright, watched her struggle for air. The inhaler was nearly empty. The medication was gone. Emma's lips had a faint blue tinge that made Sarah's heart stop. "Mommy," Emma wheezed, "I can't breathe right." Sarah took her to the emergency room, sat in the waiting area for 4 hours while Emma was treated, and left with another bill she couldn't pay. $3,000. The number didn't even feel real anymore. It was just another weight on a back already broken. Her car, still broken, had been parked in a loading zone because she'd had no choice. When she and Emma returned from the hospital, it was gone. Towed. The lot wanted $400 to release it, plus $50 per day in storage fees. Sarah let them keep it. What was one more loss? Harold called her into his office on Tuesday afternoon, his face resigned. "I'm cutting you to 25 hours, he said. "I'm sorry, Sarah, I really am. But I have to think about the business. 25 hours. That was barely enough to survive on when she had a place to live. With eviction looming, with Emma sick, with everything falling apart, it was nothing. It was drowning. Sarah made it through her shift somehow, smiled at customers, poured coffee, took orders. But when her break came, she locked herself in the tiny bathroom that smelled of bleach and despair, sank down against the wall, and finally allowed herself to break. The sobs came from somewhere deep, somewhere she'd kept locked away because mothers don't get to fall apart. Tears streamed down her face. Her whole body shook, and in that moment, sitting on the cold bathroom floor of a diner that barely paid her enough to survive, Sarah Collins let herself cry. The old man arrived at 6:30 on Wednesday morning, earlier than usual, something pulling him toward the diner before he could name what it was. Through the window, he saw Sarah standing near the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, her back to the dining room. He pushed through the door quietly. Her voice carried across the empty space, tight with desperation. "Please, I just need one more week. I have a daughter. She's sick. We have nowhere else to go." Silence as she listened. "I understand you have rules, but please, I'm begging you. 1 week. I'll have the money. I promise I'll have the money." Another pause, longer this time. "Please, don't do this." Her voice broke on the last word. The old man stood frozen, watching her shoulders shake. She said something else he couldn't hear, then lowered the phone slowly, like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She stood there for a long moment, one hand covering her mouth, her whole body trembling. Then she straightened, took a breath, wiped her eyes with the heels of her hands. When she turned around, she was smiling. That same bright, warm smile she gave everyone, but the old man saw what lived behind it now. Saw the cracks in the armor. Saw the drowning. "Good morning," she said, her voice only slightly unsteady. "You're early today." She moved to pour his coffee, but her hands were shaking so badly the pot rattled against the cup. Coffee splashed onto the saucer. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, reaching for a rag. "I'll get you a clean cup." "Sarah," he said gently, "are you okay?" The question hung in the air between them. For a moment, he thought she might tell him the truth. Her smile wavered. Her eyes filled with tears, she blinked away furiously. Then the mask came back, not quite as secure as before, but back nonetheless. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just tired. Long week, you know." But the old man did know. He knew because he'd spent 3 months watching her give pieces of herself away. Knew because he'd seen her pay for other people's meals with money she needed. Knew because she'd come to his apartment in a blizzard to make sure he was warm. And now, finally, he knew the full truth of who Sarah Collins was. Someone who gave everything to everyone and kept nothing for herself. Someone who was drowning and still reaching out to save others. someone who deserved to be saved. Despite everything crumbling around her, despite the 48-hour deadline ticking in her mind like a bomb, despite knowing she had nowhere to go and no way to save herself, Sarah still gave. The old man watched her move through that morning shift with a grace that seemed impossible given the weight she carried. She brought him his toast and added 2 extra pieces, warmed butter on the side even though he never asked for it. She refilled his coffee before he could lift his cup. When he tried to pay, fumbling with his coin purse, his arthritic hands making the simple task difficult, she waved him off. "It's on me today," she said softly. "Actually, let me get that," she told Harold at the register, sliding $3 from her apron. Her tip money, the money she couldn't afford to spend. The old man started to protest, but she was already walking away. When his shift ended and he prepared to leave, he shivered slightly, the cold seeping through his threadbare coat. Without a word, Sarah unwound the scarf from her own neck, the only warm thing she owned, and wrapped it around his. "Take this," she said. "No, I couldn't," he protested. "I insist. It's cold out there." It was snowing again, soft flakes that would turn vicious by nightfall. Sarah looked out the window and made a decision. "Let me walk you to the bus stop," she said. "Make sure you get there safe." They walked together through the snow, Sarah's breath forming clouds in the air, her neck exposed to the cold she'd just protected him from. At the bus stop, the old man turned to her, those pale blue eyes searching her face. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you so kind to me? To everyone? Even when you're suffering?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the snow fall. Then she smiled, and this time it reached somewhere genuine, somewhere deep. "Because everyone deserves kindness," she said simply. "Everyone deserves to feel like they matter, like they're seen. Life is hard enough without us making it harder for each other." The old man's eyes filled with tears. He squeezed her hand once, then stepped onto the bus. Sarah waved as it pulled away, then wrapped her arms around herself against the cold and walked back to the diner. She didn't know it was the last time she would see him like this. Didn't know that everything was about to change. Thursday morning at 6:47, the door stayed closed. Sarah glanced up from wiping tables, expecting to see the old man's familiar silhouette. But the street beyond the glass remained empty. She told herself he was just running late, that the cold had slowed him down, that he'd be there any minute. But 6:47 became 7 o'clock, then 7:30. And the booth in the corner sat empty. Friday morning came and went with no sign of him. Sarah's worry grew, a nagging feeling in her chest that something was wrong, but her own crisis swallowed most of her attention. She was packing her apartment in stolen moments between shifts, wrapping Emma's toys in newspaper, sorting their lives into boxes and garbage bags. Tomorrow the sheriff would come. Tomorrow they would be on the street. She called shelters, but every single one was full. Called friends, but the few she had were struggling themselves. She had no family left, no safety net. Just her and Emma and the approaching storm. Saturday, still no old man. Sunday, the booth remained empty. By Monday, Sarah's fear overrode everything else. Something was wrong. She found Harold during her break, wiping down the counter with that perpetual scowl he wore like a uniform. "That older gentleman who sits in booth 7, she said. "Do you remember his address? From when he paid with a card?" Harold looked at her suspiciously. "Why?" "I just want to check on him. He hasn't been in all week. I'm worried." Harold sighed but pulled out the receipt book, flipped through pages. "Here. Mitchell, apartment 312 on Oakwood." Sarah left as soon as her shift ended, practically running the 40 minutes to his building. Climbed those familiar stairs, knocked on door 312. No answer. She knocked again, harder. "Hello? Are you there?" Silence. The kind of silence that felt final. The landlord, when she found him, was reluctant, but eventually opened the door. The apartment was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of everything. No furniture. No worn coat hanging by the door. No coffee cups in the sink. Just bare walls and vacant rooms and dust motes floating in the afternoon light. He was gone. As though he'd never existed at all. Wednesday afternoon dragged with the particular slowness that comes after lunch rush. When the diner holds its breath before the dinner crowd, Sarah was refilling ketchup bottles at table 3, her mind elsewhere, circling the same impossible problem it had circled for days. She and Emma were staying in a motel that charged by the night, burning through the last of her savings. 2 more days, and even that would be gone. The sound of an engine made her look up. A black Mercedes pulled up outside the diner, sleek and expensive and utterly wrong for this neighborhood. It sat there like a panther among pigeons, its dark windows reflecting the gray sky. The engine cut off. 4 men emerged first, and Sarah's stomach dropped. They wore dark suits that fit too well, moved with the coordinated precision of soldiers, their eyes scanning the street and the diner with professional intensity. Bodyguards. She'd never seen bodyguards in real life, but she knew immediately what they were. They entered the diner, 2 holding the door while the other 2 stepped inside, their presence filling the small space with tension. The scattered customers looked up, conversations dying mid-sentence. 3 more men followed. Lawyers by the look of them, carrying leather briefcases, their suits worth more than Sarah made in 6 months. The lead lawyer, silver-haired and imposing, surveyed the diner with cool assessment. His eyes found Harold behind the counter. "We're looking for Sarah Collins," he said. His voice carried authority that made it not quite a question. Every head in the diner turned toward Sarah. She stood frozen, ketchup bottle in hand, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. What had she done? Had she broken some law she didn't know about? Was this about the old man? Had something happened to him, and somehow it was her fault? "I'm Sarah Collins," she heard herself say, her voice small and far away. The lawyers approached her table. The bodyguards positioned themselves near the exits. The entire diner had gone silent, everyone watching this scene unfold like witnesses to an accident. "Miss Collins," the lead lawyer said, "my name is Richard Chambers. I represent the Whitmore estate. We need to speak with you. Now." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. The Whitmore estate meant nothing to her. She'd never heard that name before in her life. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't understand. What's the Whitmore estate?" Something flickered across Richard Chambers' face. Surprise, maybe. He exchanged glances with the other lawyers. "You truly don't know," he said, and it wasn't a question. He pulled out a leather chair and sat, gesturing for Sarah to do the same. She sank into her seat, legs trembling. "Miss Collins, what can you tell me about Harold Mitchell?" "Harold Mitchell?" "The old man. He comes here every morning." "How?" Sarah said slowly. "Or he did. He's been gone for a week. I went to check on him, but his apartment was empty. Is he okay? Did something happen to him?" The lawyer opened his briefcase and withdrew a photograph. He slid it across the table. Sarah picked it up with shaking hands. It showed a man in an expensive suit standing beside a ribbon-cutting ceremony, skyscrapers visible behind him. The man was younger, healthier, but the eyes were unmistakable, those same pale blue eyes. "That's him," she whispered, "but I don't understand." "Miss Collins," Richard Chambers said carefully. "The man you know as Harold Mitchell is Harold Mitchell Whitmore III. He's the founder and chairman of Whitmore Industries. He owns 17 factories, 3 shipping companies, and has a personal net worth of approximately $4.2 billion. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Billion. The number was so large it lost meaning. "No," she said. "No, that's not possible. He wore old clothes. He counted coins. He lived in that tiny apartment." "All carefully arranged," the lawyer said. "Mr. Whitmore has been conducting what he calls a search for 3 years. After his wife died, he became convinced that everyone in his life only wanted his money. His children haven't spoken to him except through lawyers demanding their inheritance early. His friends disappeared when he stopped throwing galas, so he started going places in disguise, looking for something real." Sarah's world tilted. Nothing made sense. The old man who trembled over toast was a billionaire? "Why?" she whispered. "Why would he do that?" Richard Chambers pulled out more documents. spreading them across the table like evidence in a trial. Photos of a younger Harold Whitmore with a beautiful woman, both smiling at charity galas and family gatherings. His wife, Catherine, died 3 years ago, the lawyer explained. They'd been married for 42 years. She was his partner in everything. When she passed, something broke in Mr. Whitmore. He slid another document forward. Legal papers. Within 24 hours of her death, his 3 children filed preliminary claims on the estate. They didn't attend the funeral to grieve. They attended to assess assets. They've been fighting over his money ever since, wanting him to distribute it now. Wanting control. None of them have visited him. None have called to ask how he's doing. Sarah's hand covered her mouth. After that, he began to question everything. The second lawyer, a woman named Patricia, continued. Who in his life actually cared about him versus his wealth? So he started testing. He would go places dressed as he did at your diner, looking for authentic human connection. Richard pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with handwritten notes. He's visited 47 different establishments over 3 years. Coffee shops, diners, parks, libraries. Everywhere he went, he documented what happened. Sarah's eyes scanned the pages. Churchill Cafe, dismissed by staff, asked to leave. Morrison Street Diner, servers complained loudly about poor tippers. Valley View Restaurant, manager demanded he order more or vacate the table. Page after page of rejection, judgment, dismissal. At some places, people recognized him despite the disguise and suddenly became obsequiously kind, proving his worst fears. At others, he was invisible, or worse, treated with contempt for being old and poor. He was looking for someone who would treat him with dignity, not because of what he had, but because of who he was, Patricia said softly. Someone whose kindness wasn't a transaction. Someone real. Richard turned to the last entry in the notebook. Murphy's Diner. The handwriting here was different, fuller, hopeful. He found you, Miss Collins. And everything changed. Mr. Whitmore instructed us to conduct a background investigation, Richard said, pulling out a thick folder. Everything we did was legal and above board. I want to be clear about that. But he wanted to understand your situation. Sarah's breath caught. They knew. They knew everything. We know about your daughter, Emma, and her cystic fibrosis, Patricia said gently. We know about the medical bills, the eviction, the car, your reduced hours. We know you're currently staying in a motel and have approximately 3 days before you can't afford that anymore. Tears burned Sarah's eyes. The humiliation of having her desperation laid bare in front of strangers made her want to sink through the floor. Mr. Whitmore has instructed us to present you with the following, Richard said, his voice formal now. Legal. First, a full scholarship fund for Emma Collins, covering all educational expenses from now through university, including medical school if she chooses. Estimated value, $1.2 million. Sarah couldn't breathe. Second, all current and future medical expenses for Emma's treatment to be paid in full through the Whitmore Medical Foundation. No caps, no limits. Estimated lifetime value, $3 to $5 million. The room spun. Third, all your current debts cleared. Credit cards, medical bills, back rent, everything. Total amount, $47,312. Additionally, rent paid for 2 years on a 3-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood near good schools. Fourth, a trust fund established in your name, managed by our firm, with quarterly disbursements to ensure financial stability. Initial deposit, $500,000. Sarah's hands shook so badly she had to grip the table. Fifth, a position at Whitmore Industries as Director of Community Outreach, starting salary $120,000 per year, plus full benefits, including comprehensive health insurance for you and Emma. The total package, Richard said, is valued at approximately $7.3 million. Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The numbers were impossible, meaningless, too large to comprehend. This couldn't be real. This didn't happen to people like her. No. Sarah heard herself say. The word came from somewhere deep, somewhere that had kept her standing through every storm. I can't accept this. The lawyers exchanged glances. Richard leaned forward. Miss Collins, I understand this is overwhelming. You don't understand, Sarah said, her voice stronger now even as tears streamed down her face. I didn't help him for money. I didn't do any of this for a reward. I just did what anyone should do. I can't take millions of dollars for being a decent human being. That's not who I am. Her pride warred with her desperation. She thought of Emma, coughing in that motel room. Thought of the medication they couldn't afford. Thought of the future slipping away like water through desperate fingers. But she'd always stood on her own 2 feet. Always worked for everything she had. Taking this felt like admitting defeat, like selling her kindness, like proving that maybe everyone was right and nothing was real unless money changed hands. Did I do something wrong? She asked suddenly. Is he angry that I came to his apartment? That I paid for things? Did I overstep? Miss Collins, no, Patricia said quickly. You misunderstand completely. This isn't charity. Richard opened another envelope, this one smaller, the paper inside clearly handwritten. Mr. Whitmore left specific instructions that if you hesitated, we were to read you this letter. In his own words, he cleared his throat and began to read. Dear Sarah, if my lawyers are reading this, it means you're refusing help, and that doesn't surprise me one bit. It's exactly who you are. But please listen, you gave me something money can't buy. You gave me 3 months of feeling human again. You saw me, not my bank account, not my name, not what I could do for you, just me. You treated me with dignity when I had nothing to offer in return. You came to my apartment in a blizzard to make sure I was warm, using money you desperately needed for yourself. You wrapped your only scarf around my neck. You gave and gave and gave, expecting nothing back. That kind of goodness is so rare I spent 3 years searching for it. This isn't charity, Sarah. This is recognition. This is me saying that your kindness has value, that you have value. Please let me do for you what you did for me. Let me see you. Let me help you survive. Let me give you the life you deserve. The letter trembled in Richard's hands. Sarah pressed her palms against her eyes, her whole body shaking with sobs she'd held back for years. But still, she hesitated. She'd been strong alone for so long she didn't know how to be anything else. Mr. Whitmore would very much like to see you, Richard said gently. If you'll allow us, we'd like to take you to him now. Sarah wiped her eyes, nodded, and followed the lawyers out to the Mercedes. The bodyguards held doors, and she slid into leather seats that were softer than her bed. They drove through the city, through neighborhoods that grew progressively wealthier, until they reached gates that opened onto a private drive. The Whitmore estate sprawled before her like something from a movie. Manicured lawns stretched in every direction. The mansion itself was 3 stories of stone and glass, with columns and balconies and windows that gleamed in the afternoon light. Staff moved efficiently across the grounds. This was wealth beyond anything Sarah had ever imagined. They led her through marble halls hung with art worth more than entire neighborhoods, past rooms filled with furniture that looked like museum pieces, until they reached a study lined with books. And there he was. Harold sat in a leather chair by the window, wearing clothes that actually fit, looking healthier and more solid than he had in the diner. But his eyes were the same, those pale blue eyes that held such loneliness. Sarah, he said, standing slowly, I'm sorry for the deception. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to reconcile the frail old man counting coins with this billionaire in his mansion. But then he smiled. That small, uncertain smile she recognized, and suddenly she saw it. The weight he carried, the loneliness that all this wealth couldn't fill, the desperate search for something real in a world where everything had a price. Sit with me, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Please. They sat as they had in the diner. The space between them, somehow the same, despite the luxury surrounding them. You saw me, Harold said simply. Everyone else saw a poor old man or a billionaire. You just saw me. Do you understand how rare that is? How precious? Sarah looked at this man who had everything and nothing. You were testing me. she said. "No," he said firmly. "I was hoping that somewhere in this world, kindness still existed without conditions. And I found it in you." Finally, Sarah understood. And finally, she accepted. The transformation happened so quickly it felt like waking from one dream into another. Within 48 hours, Sarah and Emma moved into a spacious apartment with 3 bedrooms, hardwood floors, and windows that let in actual sunlight. Emma saw specialists at the best hospital in the state, her treatments scheduled, her medications delivered in careful doses that would keep her breathing clearly for the first time in years. Sarah watched her daughter sleep without coughing, watched her chest rise and fall easily, and wept with relief she'd thought she'd never feel. But even as her life changed, Sarah stayed tethered to who she was. She didn't quit the diner immediately. Instead, she gave Harold 2 weeks' notice and spent those weeks training her replacement, a young single mother named Maria, who reminded Sarah of herself. Sarah showed her which customers needed extra attention, which ones tipped well, how to make the coffee just right. She wanted Maria to succeed the way she'd fought to succeed. On her last day, the regulars brought cards and hugged her, these strangers who'd become family through shared mornings and spilled coffee. The widow whose hand she'd held cried. The construction workers pooled their money for a gift card. Even Harold, the manager, gruff and impossible, shook her hand and said she'd been the best waitress he'd ever had. But Sarah didn't leave Murphy's diner behind completely. Every Wednesday morning, she returned. She came dressed differently now, but her smile was the same. She ordered coffee and sat in the corner booth, the one where an old man had once counted coins with trembling hands, and she watched. When she saw someone struggling, someone hungry, someone who looked like they'd lost hope, she quietly paid for their meal. She left generous tips for Maria. She bought groceries for the homeless man who still came in on Fridays. The cycle of kindness that had saved her life continued through her hands. And Murphy's Diner became a place where small miracles happened every week, funded by someone who remembered what it felt like to have nothing and chose to give anyway. 6 months later, Sarah sat in an office on the 15th floor of Whitmore Tower, surrounded by windows that offered views of the entire city. Her title was embossed on the door in gold letters, Director of Community Outreach, Whitmore Foundation. But the title meant less to her than the work itself. She managed a foundation that helped families exactly like hers had been, families drowning in medical debt, families facing eviction, families where parents worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford to keep their children fed and healthy. Every application that crossed her desk was a story she recognized, a reflection of who she'd been 6 months ago. And she helped every single one she could. Harold visited her office every Wednesday morning at 9, the same ritualistic precision he'd brought to the diner. They drank coffee together, his in a fine china cup now, hers in a mug that said "World's Best Mom" that Emma had picked out. They talked about foundation business, but mostly they just talked. 2 friends who'd found each other in the most unlikely way. Their bond had deepened into something neither had expected. He was the grandfather Emma had never had, showing up to her school plays and doctor's appointments. She was the daughter he'd lost to greed and resentment, someone who cared about him rather than his money. Emma thrived in ways that made Sarah's heart ache with gratitude. She attended a private school where her teachers understood her condition. She had friends who came over for playdates. She ran and played without gasping for air, her cheeks pink with health instead of blue with oxygen deprivation. She was 7 years old and finally got to be a child. Sarah processed applications with the efficiency born from understanding. A single mother whose car had broken down received immediate assistance. A family facing eviction got rent paid and job counseling. A father whose son needed surgery found every bill covered before he even knew to worry. She signed checks and made calls and changed lives, but she never forgot the weight of that eviction notice, never forgot counting coins for Emma's medication, never forgot what it felt like to drown while smiling. She hadn't forgotten where she came from, and that memory made her better at where she was going. 1 year to the day after 3 lawyers and 4 bodyguards walked into Murphy's Diner, Sarah stood on a stage in front of reporters, philanthropists, and community leaders. Behind her, a banner read, the Harold Whitmore Kindness Initiative in simple, elegant letters. The program was Sarah's design, her vision brought to life with Harold's resources. It identified service workers, waitresses and janitors and grocery clerks and hotel maids, people who worked invisible jobs for invisible wages. And it helped them. Secretly, quietly, without fanfare, medical bills paid anonymously, rent covered by mysterious benefactors, cars repaired by unknown donors, college funds established for their children. The foundation employed investigators not to judge, but to find people whose kindness outweighed their circumstances. People who gave when they had nothing to give. People like Sarah had been. Harold sat in the front row, watching Sarah speak with pride radiating from every line of his face. He was 78 years old, and for the first time in years, he wasn't lonely. He had a friend, a family of sorts, a purpose beyond accumulation. One act of kindness had saved them both. The initiative launched that day would help thousands, maybe millions over time. But its real power was simpler. It proved that goodness still existed, that humanity still mattered, that one person treating another with dignity could change everything. And now, let me speak directly to you, because this story isn't just about Sarah and Harold, it's about all of us. Every single day, we encounter people whose struggles we cannot see. The waitress who smiles while her world falls apart. The elderly person counting coins at the register. The single parent working 3 jobs. The teenager who seems angry but is really just hungry. We never know who they really are. We never know what battles they're fighting. We never know how one act of kindness might echo through their lives and return to ours in ways we cannot predict. Sarah gave a lonely billionaire his humanity back, and he gave her a future. But the real magic wasn't in the money. It was in the seeing, in the treating someone with dignity when they had nothing to offer, in the choice to be kind when kindness cost everything and nothing at all. So I ask you, what if you're the person someone is waiting for? What if your smile, your patience, your small act of generosity is the thing that saves someone today? Be kind. Always. To everyone. You never know who you're helping. You never know how it might come back. If this story moved you, share it. Let it remind others that kindness matters. And tomorrow, when you see someone struggling, be their Sarah. Be their Harold. Be the reason someone believes goodness still exists in this world.